Thank you, Adam. And I am also going to talk about a filter feeder, but a much bigger one. So you were talking about these large ones. This historically would be all we would know of a whale. For much of human evolutionary history, one would see a spout, an exhalation somewhere off the coastline, maybe a glint on the back, and lots of speculation about what actually was beneath the surface for hundreds of thousands of years. That relationship started to change about 3,000 years ago when people took a different approach to whales. This is the earliest known image we have of whaling. It's a petroglyph, a stone carving from Korea about 2000 BC. A group of men in a boat tethered to what's probably a gray whale or a right whale. We can't tell by the shape of the whale necessarily, but those are the slow-moving whales that are found along that coastline. We saw whales as tremendous amount of, at that time, food, but they also provided structures for houses in the form of bones, and what they used to filter, which is baleen, that was like an early form of plastic or spring steel. So going up a few thousand years, what we use for bed springs, for umbrellas, or even corsets. Whales were big money starting about 1,000 years ago. The race was on. The commercial whaling started by, as far as we know, by the Basques around 1000 AD, the earliest receipt we have for whale meat at that time. Whales were considered fish under the Catholic Church, so they were hunted for Lenten meals. They could be eaten around the year and on Fridays. The oil they provided burned very cleanly, and it was reliable while whales were still abundant, unlike, say, vegetable oils, which could be subject to droughts or floods. So whales were big money. They fueled economies in the United States and throughout Europe and eventually around the world. There was, of course, ultimately a consequence of all this hunting, and there was serial depletion. Many species went down through those hundreds of years, but this really came to a head in the 20th century when mechanized whaling, you can see there an explosive harpoon on the bottom left, and we started hunting the largest whales and then really emptying both the northern and southern hemispheres. So by the 1980s, you were talking about the 85% or 90% decline of oysters, similar declines for whales, 60 to 90%. Some species approached extinction. In the 1980s, the beginning of the 1970s, there was a shift in view in whales. And we started to understand not only what was going on at the surface, but to get an idea of what whales were like beneath the surface. There was both the fear of extinction, and also we were starting to put hydrophones beneath the water, listening to whales. Roger Payne coined the term whale songs. This is a humpback whale here. We started to understand they could communicate across entire oceans. Really, the idea and our views of whales started to change at that time. Good news is, we didn't have to go out and restore them like we do with oysters. We stopped killing them, and many species have come back phenomenally well. There are now hundreds of thousands of humpbacks. They've been taken off the endangered species list. Many large whales, many baleen whales are coming back. That, I believe, was a consequence mostly of a concern for their intrinsic value. That is, why did we care that whales were going extinct? But today what I'm going to talk about also is the other values that they have in the oceans. I would argue we didn't really understand the ecological role of whales for a long time because when oceanography started, there really weren't any whales out there. Now we're starting to see what the oceans look like as whales come back. There are a few countries that continue whaling despite the ban. There has been a moratorium put in place since the 1980s. One of them is Japan. This, now I'm getting into sort of my background. This is around the time that I was starting to work in whale biology in the late 1990s. Japan has been arguing that as whales come back, we need to start calling them, because there'll be competition for human fisheries. And also, they say that as some abundant species increase, other more endangered species cannot come back because the minke whales, the smaller whales, are too abundant. That didn't quite sound right to me. And you can, by the way, still find these on the website. This is still part of the Japanese argument for killing whales. So this was the 1990s. I'd actually gone to Japan at that point to look at whale meat being sold on the marketplace, and we were finding a high level of fraudulence on the market. And I was also, in doing my master's degree at that point, I was taking marine ecology, sitting in the back of a class, and daydreaming a bit, but the professor was talking about the biological pump. Anyone who studies the oceans knows what this is. Basically, photosynthesis, of course, can only occur at the surface of the ocean where there's light. But as phytoplankton die and as zooplankton and fish feed upon those, the organic matter tends to settle. That's the biological pump, right? You're seeing this organic matter settle, carbon, other nutrients settling to the bottom. Well, as I was in class, I had noticed something very different when I was out in the oceans. And what I would see, and I recently had been in my attic and uncovered my notebook from that class the day I was taking that class, and put in, when right whales and other whales feed, they go to the bottom, and they come to the surface, and they release enormous nutrients. Has anyone ever seen whale feces? Just wondering if anyone's ever been out on a boat and see that. Yeah, a few. It's this enormous plume. The plume can be as large as the research boats that we use. So they're going down to the surface. They have mud on their heads often. They're coming up, and rather they're going down at depth, and they come to the surface and release those plumes. And even then, as early as that first day when I had this idea, I wrote, what about when there were 10,000 whales? I was studying right whales at the time. There were only maybe 400, 500 in the ocean, in the North Atlantic. But what about when there were 10,000? How would that have influenced the ocean and productivity in the ocean? So for those of you who are wondering, those who haven't seen whale feces, there's some, I believe that's from blue whales here at the bottom. And then here you could see another sort of fecal plume, this wide plume, almost admittedly like diarrhea. Here's the first image that I put together with Jim McCarthy, who's here at OEB. Here's the biological pump with nutrients going down. And here are whales feeding beneath the euphotic zone, that is in the dark part of the ocean, coming to the surface and releasing those nutrients. So we were pretty excited about this work, and hopefully, we submitted this to a couple of big journals, and one of our colleagues said, well, yeah, okay, so they release some nitrogen or some iron at the surface. Is that ecologically important, or is it a fart in a hurricane, right? Maybe it doesn't really matter. So they put a few nutrients at the surface. So we examined the number of whales that are here in the Gulf of Maine off the coast of Massachusetts, and found indeed, we're looking at nitrogen flux here, that whales bring more nitrogen to the surface than all the rivers combined in the Gulf of Maine. So that's a large amount, not as much as atmospheric deposition. Humans, by putting pollutants into the air, there's still a lot of nitrogen that's raining down, but almost comparable to coastal point sources, which is sewage that's being released there. For whales, though, it's being released into the productive areas off the coast. So we don't have any reason to believe that we think that this is increasing the productivity in that area, enhancing photosynthesis, which also can affect zooplankton populations and fish populations. So they're subsidizing the areas where they're feeding. Well, we submitted that, and we submitted it as a model. And our reviewers noted that we live in Massachusetts. We didn't actually go out and collect any of this feces. So we realized we had to go out and actually go and collect this. So you can see that there, judged as one of the worst jobs in science. I would argue getting to spend a day out on the water following whales around is not that bad. But point taken. Among the most productive areas that we found for finding whale feces This is a North Atlantic right whale surface active group or courtship group. It's one female in the center and several males trying to mate with her. This can last hours, and there's lots of feces in the water. It's churning up. They're releasing nutrients, really large amount of nutrients into that area. And this is one way where we can reliably collect feces, is that way. Colleagues of mine at the New England Aquarium had an even more clever idea on how to collect feces. Any of you have ever seen feces, you know you could see it sort of just beneath the surface, but if you've been close, you know it really stinks. It's got a very strong smell. If you get it on your clothes, basically you can't wash that smell out. So Roz Rolland and a couple of others suggested, why not use sniffer dogs to find this? If it's hard to find feces, they trained 2 dogs on the scent of right whale feces and then brought those dogs out to smell for fecal plumes. This is Fargo. He's a 90-pound Rottweiler. He started out his career as a companion dog for an elderly woman. When she died, he became a sniffer dog for drugs in a prison, and then got what I think for many dogs would be a dream job, became a wildlife detecting dog. He was originally trained on grizzly scats and other wild scats, and then got this job on the boat. Unfortunately for Fargo, he suffered from seasickness, so he had to take Dramamine before he went out there. Worse yet was Bob, his colleague, who was terrified of whales. So anytime the whale lifted up, he would hover at the bottom of the boat. Bob didn't make it beyond a season, but Fargo went a couple of seasons. Sadly, he's passed on since that picture. This is what it looks like. You've all probably seen dogs detect on a scent trail, right? They're going up a scent cone, and you see them moving like this. But of course, they can move on land. There might be problems with hills and trees, but they can move on the ocean. You have to have the boat driver who's following that, right? You can see here, this is about a mile or 2 away. This indicates that that Fargo is on the scent. They're going upwind, and then once you get the X, it means he's off the scent. Usually you could tell when a dog's excited by the tail wagging. It's a Rottweiler, though. It just had a little small tail. They would call it the happy inch. After it went, so Fargo doesn't detect it, so you turn the direction of the boat. This indicates that he's excited, he's on it, and then eventually up the prevailing wind. And this circle indicates when humans can smell it, so we can smell it about 100 meters away, and then finding that sample. And he really helped to optimize the finding of these samples at that time. So, what did we find? Indeed, that there are very high levels of both nitrogen and phosphorus in the fecal plumes. These can be the limiting nutrients in many ocean systems. The other one is iron, and that colleagues of mine have worked in the southern hemisphere looking at iron in the fecal plumes. I don't think Pete came back, but Pete is a colleague of mine. We've worked together on looking at the microbiome. Oh, there he is. Pete, we don't collect this by hand. So if you're worried, there's like, well, that's how you guys have been telling me we've been doing it in plankton nets. We don't do that. But this is a colleague of mine who just shows you for size. So high levels of phosphate and ammonium indeed in those fecal plumes. So why does that matter? Well, in the summertime, a lot of this work was done on Stellwagen Bank, so right here off of Massachusetts. In the wintertime, you have lots of churning, high nutrients, it's windy, right? So you don't tend to have any nutrient limitation, but in the summer, a thermocline forms, that is between the upper area, the warmer upper body, and the colder lower area. Lots of nutrients in that lower area where you don't have sunlight or very low sunlight. At the surface, though, there's a decline in nutrients. This is when whales are most abundant in that area. So they're going up and back and forth through that thermocline, feeding below it, and this indicates the population of whales off the coast of Massachusetts, but this is true for many areas. This is the time when they're releasing those nutrients. So it's ecologically important at that point. Even more important, and again, I had mentioned, even early on, I realized, well, we're in a time of whale deficit. Even if whales are coming back, we're still looking at an ocean that's largely emptied of whales. What about in the past? Well, this is when whales would have really been major drivers in these ocean systems. And I argue and I hope that they'll be important again as populations start to come back. Coastal point, this is before humans impacted the oceans. Coastal point source, so there wasn't any sewage there. Atmospheric deposition was at about 20%, it is now. That is from nitrogen coming out of the atmosphere. And then this is trying to judge how, we don't really know how many whales there were in the past, so this gives 3 scenarios. Either way you look at it, whales were major drivers at that point in the past, and we hope can be in the future. So what I would argue that this refutes the claims that the Japanese and indeed Canadian and Norwegian government claim that we need to cull marine mammals because they are limiting fisheries and limiting productivity. It's actually more complicated than that. Whales, of course, retain those nutrients and release those nutrients in that system, so those culls can be counterproductive in the oceans. That's the management story. Connected to this conference, there's been some work in the Southern Ocean looking at the role of iron in sperm whales, and their estimates are, so this is carbon released by fossil fuels. Just so we know, whales aren't going to save the problem of climate change, sadly. They will play an important role, just like they can play an important role like reforestation, but they're not going to get to the levels of the carbon we're putting in through burning petroleum. But they're exporting about 400,000 tons of carbon a year by bringing those nutrients, and then they're sinking. So when it's getting into the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, it's sinking through the biological pump. They also, of course, they're animals, so they're respiring. So even when you subtract that 400,000 tons of carbon from 200, there's a net loss or a net sinking of carbon. So it can act as a sink. I want to note, not everyone this is an argument among biological oceanographers. So recently, I worked with a colleague of mine who was then at Oxford. We were looking at, so we have this calculation for whales, but how do other animals play a role? How can we, in a sense, revitalize nutrient cycling on the planet? Not only in the oceans, the whales are bringing up phosphate, nitrogen, and iron. In this case, we're looking at phosphorus here. So if whales are bringing that up, how can that actually get on land? The phosphorus that we're now using throughout much of the world is mined in areas like Morocco and brought to the farms. Is there a way that we can bring back some populations of animals that can help redistribute this phosphorus essentially for free? So we have whales bringing it to the surface. How could that come on land? Well, historically, and we'll hear some talk about this today, anadromous fish, and think about salmon in the Pacific Northwest might be a classic story. They're bringing those nutrients upstream, right? We don't have to carry them up out of the ocean. They're actually doing it when they die or when they're breeding. They're bringing nutrients up to the surface, or rather up the watersheds. We also see seabirds can bring this towards land as well. Once it gets up there, it can be distributed. In the case of salmon, maybe by bears or eagles, and eventually herbivores and other megafauna are distributing it. So this is sort of our dream, is to think about, can that happen? I live in Vermont, in a place like Lake Champlain. How could this happen? One, you could have filter feeders, freshwater mussels in that case, but you could restore salmon populations that could bring some of these nutrients up. Beavers can help retain it. Someone had spoken about beavers earlier today. Deer and perhaps even predators can distribute this phosphorus. This is going to be a challenge, but we're working towards that, right? We're seeing that. This is another ecological advantage that we can have of restoring these populations. So how are whales keystone species going finally beyond poop a little bit? I'm not sure if I have another poop slide, but we'll see. So of course they're important. They play an important role as predators. We've discussed nutrient transfer. Large whales are actually also prey. They're fed on by, especially the young, historically by large sharks, now by killer whales, and we're seeing increases of killer whale attacks, but also carcasses. And this might be a nice lead-in for Pete later on. I don't know if he'll discuss that, but when whales die, they bring nutrients down into the deep sea, and in fact, entire communities can depend on it. They also can engineer their environment in some sense in an ephemeral way. This is a bubble net for humpback whales, so they go beneath a school of herring. they release air bubbles, they come up through that net, and they capture that herring. This is, I would argue, a form of engineering, though it's a rather short-lived one, right? But it can have an effect on the thermocline. But there are other whales that are actually affecting the benthic area of the oceans as well. This is a gray whale. They're feeding on amphipods that are at the ocean bottom, and they'll leave furrows at the bottom of the ocean that can last for centuries. So sometimes it's hard to get your head around when you're thinking about something like an oyster that you can see or a beaver dam. It's a little harder to think about how pelagic species might affect the oceans. So this is a gray whale. This is what a whale carcass or a whale fall looks like. Here's a way, we're talking about carbon, that carbon can be sequestered. When a whale dies, we don't have trees in the ocean, but we do have large animals, lots of animals, right? And so they're absorbing that carbon in their bodies, and then when they die, they're sequestering it into the deep sea. As far as I know, there are at least 60 species of animals that are only found on these whale carcasses. Others that are common to hydrothermal vents that Pete discussed, or that are also common with methane seeps. So some species are generalists in the deep sea. Others are just found on that. And we've done some modeling to look at what's the impact of whaling on these deep sea species. And indeed, some of the earliest extinctions in the oceans may have been in these whale fall megafauna, or the rather whale fall fauna, because we took so much of their habitat away. This is Ocedox here, or it's a type of worm that maybe Pete's going to talk about this too. It doesn't feed, but it relies on bacteria, symbiotic internal bacteria, in order to get its nutrients, one that's found only on whales. So there it gives you an example of just how big whales can be, right? Historically, that when whales were abundant in the oceans, they were probably taking about 200,000 tons of carbon per year out of the atmosphere through these whale falls. Now it's down to about 30,000 tons of carbon. But as we see whale populations come back, this could be one way of mitigating and sequestering carbon. Again, they're storing it in their bodies, and it's also sequestering it in the deep sea. Whales are just part, of course, of a whole suite of animals that play a large role in the carbon cycle in the oceans. Here we see the whale pump, but of course large fish, bony fish, also are sequestering this. So by restoring the oceans, both of large mammals, but also large fish, it could have a big impact on global climate. Good news is the IWC, I had mentioned earlier, there was a moratorium in the 1980s. That was started, the International Whaling Commission was started in the 1940s in order to develop sustainable whaling. It was never the goal to keep whale populations high, but necessarily make sure there are enough whales in order for countries to hunt them. About a month ago, Chile submitted a resolution that acknowledges the role of living whales, the ecosystem services and the ecological effects of whales, and that was passed in the International Whaling Commission about a month ago. So we're not only thinking about what the value is of a whale when it's dead, but also we'll be looking at research and thinking about ways that we can restore that, because they're examining the role that they actually play in the oceans themselves. I've spoken about Japan, and often when people think about whaling, they think about Japan or Norway or Iceland, and I want to make sure that everyone in this room realizes that we all whale. We all have impacts on whales. We just don't do it on purpose, but that doesn't mean we don't kill whales. Whales get caught in lines, in lobster lines, and there are, I think the number is 60%, or it might be as high as 70% of all right whales have entanglement scars. They've been caught at least once in fishing gear, in fixed fishing gear, and we also run them over in ships. So whaling affects whales, but so do these, and we can make a difference there. We can change the gear. We can also, rather than only protesting other countries, we also need to be concerned about these issues. And we don't even know at this point what the mortality effects are of ocean noise and ocean pollution. Again, I'll end on a positive note. We can turn this around, and we did. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, passed in 1972, has been phenomenally successful. At this point, 2/3 of all US marine mammals that we know the population size, they're still increasing. They've been increasing, and they're still increasing. We're starting to take these species off of the endangered species list. The good news, if you're a conservation biologist, is marine mammals have another act that protects them. So when you delist them, no one's going to go out and kill them. People that live on Cape Cod probably know of the conflicts, the concerns about the gray seals. Good news is, from my view, they're still protected and they're coming back. Many species around the world have been restored simply by removing that threat. And with that, thank you very much. This is, I grew up in New York, and I was thrilled to see that humpback whales are now feeding in and around New York Harbor for the first time in my lifetime. Thank you.